Hey everybody, it's Rabbit. Welcome to the channel, and today we're just going to have a little discussion about the M1 Abrams and whether or not the Abrams is potentially a vehicle that has been overrated or even underrated. It's always an interesting discussion to have, but the problem with over or underrated vehicles is you have to answer two questions first. Who is rating it, and on what scale are they rating it? What criteria are they using to rate that vehicle? Obviously, since both of those features are kind of nebulous, we're mostly going to focus on the vehicle's history, its adoption, and of course its current future, because the Abrams did recently get a bit of an update from the US Army. Now, if you aren't tracking current events, the US Army essentially announced that it will be canceling the Service Enhancement Package version 4 and going for the M1 E3. So the Service Enhancement Package is a series of upgrades to the M1A2 model to bring it up to a standard that they view as capable for modern warfare. The M1E3, the Army even describes this in its announcement. The E designation, you'll notice this from like World War II vehicles, is a major manufacturing change to the vehicle, but it hasn't officially been adopted yet. So in theory, if the E3 does get adopted, it will become the M1A3 Abrams. Now, what this essentially means is that the current upgrades to the V4, some of them are still going to go through as general upgrades to the fleet. However, the entire V4 package isn't going to be upgraded to the fleet. The Army is ultimately looking for the E3, theoretically A3 at that time, to enter service around early 2030s. The two big features the Army was looking at when they released the statement was, number one, reducing the weight of the vehicle, number two, reducing logistics of the vehicle. These could mean a lot of factors. The Abrams started out as around 55 tons, and currently, depending on exactly which armor packages are installed, will top out at a little over 70. So this doesn't leave a lot of room for upgradability before you start putting a lot of stress on the drivetrain, or even the ability to ship the Abrams overseas via various methods such as aircraft. So with that lack of upgradability in mind, the Army's looking to shave weight. Exactly how much weight they're looking to shave and where they're looking to take it off, they haven't really said. And when they talk about logistics, whether that means replacing the gas turbine with something else or using something else entirely, trying to simplify parts, who knows? The Army has been kind of vague on these aspects. They're likely in the process of evaluating different ways in which they can achieve these goals right now. We probably won't hear much from this for at least a few years in terms of more concrete specifications on the A3. But of course, all of this brings us back around to kind of the origins of the Abrams and whether or not the vehicle has ever really been the best tank in the world. So it's important to realize a piece of context. Both the Abrams and the Leopard is the MBT-70 project, or the KPZ-70 project for Germany. This was supposed to be a joint project between USA and Germany in which the United States and Germany worked together on the tank, agreed on all the specifications. There would be a lot of parts commonality, almost 100% parts commonality. And it was also supposed to be a very advanced tank. If you look at the specifications for the MBT-70, you have a 20mm remote weapon station, you have an auto-loaded 152mm gut missile launcher, hydro-pneumatic suspension system that can be manually controlled by the driver, the entire crew was in the turret, the driver had a counter-rotating cupola, just a whole bunch of features that were kind of space age at the time. The problems with this vehicle started to mount right away when even basic stuff like what manufacturing measurements they should use, whether it be metric or imperial, kind of became a sore spot. And then, of course, what gun you should use. United States and Germany obviously have different like logistical trains. They have different theaters that they're going to operate in. So the political aspect got to be a problem, but also technical aspects got to be a problem. The counter-rotating cupola for the driver to keep them facing forward caused a lot of motion sickness, which is obviously a bit of an issue. And overall, the program just went very over time and very over budget, and this resulted in both USA and Germany pulling out. Now, the USA did try to salvage something out of this with the XM803 that was supposed to be a more simplified version, but at the end of the day, there just wasn't enough to salvage, and the entire MBT-70 program died on the vine. But ultimately, the death of the MBT-70 did lead to the Leopard 2 and the Abrams, so it's probably one of the most successful failures in tank history, if that makes any sense. Now, there are some like pseudo myths that go on with the initial Abrams adoption that seem to kind of indicate that maybe it was adopted for political reasons or it wasn't the best option, whatever. The issue with trying to address these is you can't definitively prove a negative. You can't go into the state of mind of everybody making every decision and know exactly why they did what they did. All we can really do is follow the paper trail, and As of right now, the paper trail doesn't seem to indicate that there were any major political reasons for the current version of the Abrams adopted, or the version that was officially adopted. So, to address some of the concerns, there's a common myth that the Chrysler was adopted over the GM prototype because Chrysler was an ailing company financially. The issue with this is we actually have a memorandum from Donald Rumsfeld at the time, wherein he is discussing with the United States Army. The United States Army wants to Frankenstein the two vehicles together. Essentially, they like the gas turbine on the Chrysler XM1, but they also like the hull on the GM XM1, and they want to marry the two. However, after MBT 70 being a complete boondoggle, going over time and over budget, Rumsfeld basically nixes this, says pick one or the other, not both. Like, we're not screwing around with this anymore, just tell me which one you want. And that's ultimately why they went with the Chrysler, because the Army liked the gas turbine. Now, this of course leads to a whole other discussion about the gas turbine itself. In testing, the Army found the gas turbine was significantly quieter than diesels. It also had another major advantage over diesel engines, that when you start up a diesel engine, you generally produce a big plume of smoke, so you kind of give away your position. And the anticipated way in which the Army would be fighting would be essentially in defensive postures, where their tanks would be off and they would start them up, fire their shots, and withdraw. And the diesel engine simply didn't work as well for that as, say, a theoretical gas turbine. Whether or not, in retrospect, we find those advantages to be meaningful enough, who knows. But at the time, that was the Army's thought process. And of course, if you look at the gas turbine, one of the biggest complaints is fuel economy. But this is a bit of a disingenuous argument, because you kind of have to understand how the gas turbine works relative to a diesel. A diesel can output more or less power, like it has different modes, whereas a gas turbine is essentially on or off. So at peak performance, the gas turbine is very efficient. However, if you're just idling, it's very inefficient. This is part of the reason for the adoption of auxiliary power units, or APUs, for Abrams to operate the subsystem, so you wouldn't have to idle the engine just to power it. But it's a whole other discussion about fuel economy, where it's not as binary as like it is or isn't good. And then of course you have the other kind of urban myth, is that the Abrams was put against the Leopard 2, the Abrams lost, but the Army decided on the Abrams anyway. This is not really accurate. First off, the Leopard prototype that was shipped didn't actually have its armor package installed, so it was noticeably lighter than it should have been, which also gave it some advantage in the mobility trials. The German Leopard 2 team tried to blame the US Army as though they had some kind of vendetta, but there's no information in the Army documentation saying this is the case. As I said earlier, you can't really prove a negative, so there's no way to say definitively the Army didn't have any misgivings about the vehicle over this misunderstanding, but there's nothing in the documentation itself to point to it. It's just the German Leopard 2 team perceived that this was the case, and that perception has been repeated a lot, but there's never been any strong supporting evidence that the trials were excessively harsh on the Leopard 2. There was also an issue with the Leopard 2 in that the version that the Army wanted would have taken more time and more money than the Abrams would have to put into production. And this, coupled with the fact that the performance characteristics of the vehicle were broadly similar, and the Army did kind of prefer the gas turbine, but the Army ultimately ended up rejecting it in favor of just going with the Abrams. And this is where we also wrap back around to a big point about a lot of these myths about basically the US Army choosing the inferior vehicle. Is anybody trying to definitively make the statement that the Chrysler variant was dramatically inferior to the GM variant, or the XM1 that was tested against the Leopard was dramatically inferior to the Leopard, is being kind of disingenuous. All the testing data I've seen, they're pretty much interchangeable. There's not huge differences between the vehicles, so smaller differences like one has the gas turbine, which they prefer, or production or manufacturing costs or timelines are probably going to be much more incisive factors than very minor differences in terms of relative vehicle performance. Which of course raises the question about the decision to maintain the 105mm on the original variant of the M1. This makes a lot of sense for several different reasons. Number one, it's important to remember that the L7 family of 105mm guns was significantly more mature at the time of the Abrams inception than the L44 120mm. So the shell selection that you had was much more mature, and in practice, the difference in penetration was pretty negligible with their top armor-piercing rounds. However, the United States Army weren't idiots. They knew the 120mm had significantly more energy, so it was only a matter of time before the shells started rolling out that were noticeably more powerful than what you could really do with a 105. So the Abrams had provisions to equip the 120 later, but at least the initial batch of Abrams stuck with the 105mm, both because they had a lot of the rounds in inventory and there weren't any significant advantages to the 120, at least at that time. So it was kind of a cost-saving measure, and you'll see this throughout the Abrams. Is the Abrams wasn't designed to be the best tank in the world. In fact, the vast majority of tanks are never designed to be the best tank in the world. Quite the opposite. Tanks are designed to meet a set of specifications. The specifications will include things like threats they're likely to face, terrain that they're likely to encounter, and additionally also have manufacturing and cost elements, because if you can't build it or you can't afford them in quantities, it doesn't really matter how good they are. And especially coming off the heels of MBT-70, the United States Army just wasn't in a good position to dump a lot of money into another brand new tank. But they did need something that had a lot more longevity than the older M60 chassis, which were definitely getting long in the tooth, and a lot of the armor packages and upgrades that you see on Abrams wouldn't have necessarily fit in the M60. That being said, the Abrams still represents a pretty safe pick by and large, because you do have things like the fire control system is lifted almost entirely from the M60A3 TTS. And there's only really 3 big features on the Abrams that the M60 can't really replicate, and that is the gas turbine, which ultimately did end up providing a very good power to weight ratio for the tank and allowed it to be upgraded into the 70-ton range. You also have the bustle rack with the blowout panels. This provided a significant amount of protection for the tank. And then of course you have the Chobham armor, and none of these features are really that complex or off the wall to implement on a vehicle. And this is kind of the idea. It's less of we are going to make the best tank in the world and more of we are going to make good of a bad situation to try and get a vehicle that can carry us forward, even if it's not necessarily the best in the world. What's interesting to me is that even though the Abrams gets thought of as this top-of-the-line tank where like no expenses spared in terms of cost, there are actually pretty persistent cost-saving measures throughout its lifespan. For example, the M1 A1 was originally supposed to not only incorporate the 120mm, but also a commander's intent thermal viewer, and you can even see the spot where it was supposed to be attached on the M1 A1. Usually they keep an extra road wheel there. But of course this was too expensive, so they ultimately deleted that feature at the last minute, and it wasn't incorporated until you get to the M1 A2 series. So even though we like to think of the Abrams, especially if you're in America, as this best top-of-the-line, spared no expense, spend every penny on it tank, it actually was a lot more of an efficient cost-saving vehicle than most people realize. But this does get to one of the ironies of the Abrams, in that by the time the Abrams was at full-scale production, the US Army was happy with their inventory and was ready to start shipping it out to exporters. The Cold War was essentially over. And this meant that vehicles like the Leopard 2A4 and the T-72 had significant advantages in the export market, because a lot of nations weren't anticipating another large-scale war for a while. And those that were looking for vehicles, a lot of countries were drawing down their major armored forces, which meant that Leopard 2A4s and T-72Ms were now available on the cheap. So depending on what you could easily get ammunition for, you could find a vehicle that was relatively comparable to the Abrams for less money fairly easily. And this meant the Abrams didn't originally see a huge amount of export success, and this is often misinterpreted as companies were trying out the Abrams with other vehicles and found the Abrams simply be inferior, but it's more a matter of most countries did not anticipate a significant need for a much better tank, and those that did only wanted them in small batches, so the Leopard 2A4 being available very cheap was simply a more viable alternative. Conversely, the Abrams would have been a more expensive option just because they would have been producing them fresh off the assembly line coming off of the United States Army's orders. This does lead to kind of an interesting scenario where the T-72Ms, the major export model of T-72, kind of ends up being a victim of its own success. It was a very successful design, it's very inexpensive, the gun works, the vehicle is fairly easy to operate and maintain, anybody can use it. But the downside of that is that everybody does use it, and it gets used by a lot of militaries that can't necessarily support it correctly. They don't have good combined arms, don't have adequate money to train their crews, etc., etc. And this leads to the T-72 getting a reputation as a bit of a fodder vehicle. Conversely, the Abrams only really being operated by the United States, and to a lesser extent Saudi Arabia, it doesn't really see major action, and when it does see major action, it's universally very well supported. So while the T-72 is a victim of its own success, the Abrams is kind of a beneficiary of its obscurity, I guess, would be the way you put it. where the fact that you only have one operator and that operator can afford to support it very effectively means that the only time you ever see it is when it is in the best possible circumstances. The Abrams isn't necessarily the best tank, but when in the hands of the United States military, it often doesn't have to be the best tank. If there's a scenario where it is suboptimal, other combat arms can simply take over and fill in the gaps and capabilities of that vehicle. And this is kind of the point I'm wrapping back around to with all of this discussion about, is the Abrams the best, and going into cost effectiveness and its design history. You can have conversations about whether it's the best, worst, overrated, underrated, etc. all day, but at the end of all of the discussion, you have to go back and look at the service history of the Abrams in the United States military and say, is there any point where the United States military has been at a disadvantage because it was fielding Abrams? And the answer is simply no. Whether it's the best or the worst, it doesn't really matter. The Abrams is capable of doing its job, and that is simply enough because the military in which it has largely been operating, they only need it to do its job. And not to go into too large of a spiel on this topic specifically, but when you look at most tanks, there's a lot of national pride, esprit de corps. People think their tanks is the best. British crews think the Challenger is the best. German crews think the Leopard is the best. Russian crews think the T-90M is the best. And most of these crews are probably correct. And you might say, how can everybody have the best? Well, it turns out the best, there's a big asterisk on it, for that nation. Because not every nation can build, operate, and maintain every tank in the quantities needed to actually have an impact on the battlefield. To use an example, Italy in World War II is kind of famous for having bad tanks. Tanks like the M1441 had riveted construction, fairly lightweight, not super powerful guns, but ultimately if you look at Italy terrain-wise, Italy has a lot of mountains. Moving big heavy tanks around is kind of difficult. On top of that, if you look at the Italian industrial capacity and the state of Italian industry, doing large numbers of welded hull tanks would have been quite difficult because experienced welders are needed for ships, planes, all other materials of war. You can't necessarily spend all of those on tanks. On top of that, cast construction, which is the other type of preferred method, requires large casting facilities, which Italy didn't necessarily have access to. So, okay, welded and cast construction are better, but if you don't have those as options, then you kind of have to go with riveted construction if you want to be able to field these tanks in any kind of meaningful numbers. So when you say, could Italy have, in World War II, have theoretically fielded a better tank in sufficient quantities, the answer is no. The only way they could have fielded a better tank in sufficient quantities is to not be Italy in World War II. And at that point, you're talking something so hypothetical that it's not even really worth discussing. And if we wind back the clock, Germany has a good tank building industry. They can afford to build a Leopard 2, they can afford to maintain it. But if you get videos like, for example, Maximus, who has talked several times about how nations should have their own tank building industry, simply not viable. Building and designing a modern tank is incredibly expensive. It's a lot easier to buy them and support them. And I don't necessarily agree with him that every country should have their own tank building industry. Certainly, if your country can afford to maintain that kind of industry, that's fine. But for the vast majority of countries, it simply wouldn't be viable. So a tank that simply fills their needs to an acceptable degree at a cost point and in a manufacturing capacity that they can actually produce in large numbers, and they can also maintain and repair it in large numbers, that's perfectly fine. And this is how you get to the point where most countries don't adopt tanks that are dramatically worse than what they could have theoretically adopted, because there are a lot of restrictions going on behind the scenes that aren't necessarily related to how powerful the engine is, how big the gun is, how thick the armor is, etc., etc., etc. Obviously, they want to be able to meet theoretical threats they could face, but at the end of the day, if you can only build one of tank that can do that, oh well, you might as well build the ones you can field. Ultimately, any assault that is supported by tanks is more successful than an assault that is not supported by tanks, and also suffers less casualties. So tank is always better than no tank, right? Easy enough. But obviously we have to bring some sort of conclusion off of this, so would I say the Abrams is overrated? For the average American, it's probably a little overrated in that Americans seem to think the Abrams is invincible, unstoppable, super technologically advanced, In reality, it's just a very cost-effective vehicle for doing its job, not really anything all that impressive. If somebody were to simply write it off as a dinosaur that's obsolete on the modern battlefield, my simple response to that would be citation needed. At the end of the day, its armor package and cannon are capable of engaging all targets at all ranges. There's really no reason to believe the Abrams doesn't belong on the modern battlefield, although it is definitely getting long in the tooth and could stand to use an upgrade package, which is what the Army is looking at right now. So, whether or not it's over or underrated, I guess depends on how you rate it. At the end of the day, the Abrams is unlikely in the immediate future to be in a position where it's going to have to do every combat task, even one that's not particularly well suited for. So, it can afford to be maybe a little less advanced or a little less capable than some of its contemporaries and still be perfectly fine. However, the weight is starting to become a bit of an issue. 70 tons is hitting the upper limit of what you can realistically supply and support, and the Army is almost certainly looking to cut back on that a bit. And it is hindering some of the Abrams' operational capabilities in terms of using bridges in less built-up areas, or even things like armored vehicle launch bridges that are increasingly less able to support a fully kitted Abrams. But ultimately, whether or not it's over or underrated is up to you. How do you rate a tank? And that wraps up our video. Hope you enjoyed it, hope you had fun, hope you learned something. If you did, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. That really helps out the channel, and also lets me know if people do kind of like this kind of content, because I can put together more of it if you guys are enjoying it, if you guys do find it interesting. But ultimately, if you guys aren't enjoying it, then obviously I only do this like once in a blue moon. It really just kind of depends. But hope you enjoyed it. Have a nice day, everybody.